Thank you all for coming just to share some thoughts and some reflections on really what is a challenging and complicated issue. I want to just highlight this first slide because it does encapsulate a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, but you'll see two pictures. One up, you see Pope Francis, who's got in his hand a chalice. I'll say more about that chalice in a moment. It's a very special chalice. And on the bottom right, you also see there are two people trying to connect hands, what is in fact the border wall. And these frame their reflections because these are two experiences of Eucharist, and both of them had a powerful impact on me. There's a lot of people in this room that I've journeyed with over the years. Don Kerwin, who I want to recognize, who's been with me in this for a very long time. And I know others in this room who have been working on this issue, some longer than I, but I've been in this for close to 30 years. And there are two experiences, I think, that really marked the reflections that I'll talk about tonight. And the first was when I went to the border between Mexico and the United States near the area of El Paso. And this was around November 12th, or excuse me, November 2nd. So it was around the Feast of All Saints and All Souls. And it's at that time that these communities gathered from both sides of the border, Mexico and the United States. Bishops from both sides actually came together and they joined the altar together at the fence from both sides of the border. And so they celebrated one Eucharist amidst this divided political reality. So you see this little girl on her father, presumably her father's shoulders, and she's reaching to the other side with a hand extending to the U.S. The index is someone from the United States extending their hand over to someone in Mexico. And it's a great encapsulation, I think, of what this talk is about, thinking about what the Eucharist means in the midst of this divided political reality. The second is Pope Francis. He was elected a little more than 11 years ago. We celebrated his 11th anniversary just a couple of days ago. And a couple months after he was elected, he heard the story about a group of refugees who had been crossing the Mediterranean and had died in the middle of the ocean. I'll explain a little bit more about the story in a moment. But he went down shortly after he was elected to this one island to commemorate a shipwreck and these many refugees that died. And he used a chalice made from the driftwood of a refugee boat. And so the question that came for me is that what does it mean to celebrate the Eucharist in the midst of an age of migration? So that's the question I really want to focus on tonight. And the heart of this talk really focuses just on one core idea, and it's this, is that when the dominant political narratives really are about our moving us from our oneness as a human community to otherness, who is the other, the dominant narrative of the scriptures and of Christian faith is moving from our otherness to oneness. And so the whole journey of human life, which is itself a migration, is ultimately about a journey towards unity with God, and ultimately how that gets expressed in terms of unity with each other. That's the only migration in the end that really matters, and that's really the one by which we'll be judged. So I'm going to unpack that a bit today, but as we look at that, I want to just begin with a story. I'm not really sure how I got into this issue. It found me more than I found it. But I can remember there was a number of years ago, I had gotten news that my uncle had died, and his name was Bill Grudy, and he was my godfather. So it was a very special relationship to him. And when he died, we went to Northeast Pennsylvania, near where he came from, which was Ashland, Pennsylvania. And we gathered together to celebrate the Eucharist, and we gathered to celebrate, to really pay our last respects. And afterwards, we went out to the cemetery and we laid Bill Grudy's body into the ground. And I swear this happened, is that when I went home a number of hours later, I looked through my email and I was very struck by one email because it just said on the message line, a note from Bill Grudy. So I was like, wow, he made it. He's wireless now. And it turns out that this Bill Grudy was from California. And he says, my name is Bill Grudy and my wife is away this weekend. And so I just went out on the internet and I looked to see what Grudy's were out there. And he says, I saw some of the stuff you're doing. He says, if you're ever out in Northern California, I live near the Napa Valley. And he says, I'd love to touch base. So I said, I'm actually coming out in a couple of weeks. Mark Portman knows we used to live out in Berkeley when we were doing our graduate studies. And I came into Berkeley a couple of weeks later and I invited Bill Grudy to join us. So I arrived at the house, and after I arrived at the house, they said, will you be here for dinner? And I said, yes. When I met somebody on the internet and I invited him over for dinner as well. So there was this long silence. And they're like, what? You don't even know this guy? And so I said, yeah, I'm sure it's fine. And so it turns out that Bill Grudy and I started comparing notes. And through a series of conversations, we found out that we were connected to two brothers who came over as immigrants from Ireland, probably through Canada into the United States. And they were great businessmen, and they settled up in the area what is now Lincoln Center in New York City. But they said nothing's ever going to develop here, so they just sold that. But the two brothers got into a fight, and one brother married outside the clan. So the other brother, to get back at him, said, how do I make him as angry as possible? And he says, I know what I'll do. He says, I'll become a Protestant. So his family went with the Protestant line, and my family went with the Catholic line, and it took 200 years to get the orange and the green back together again. Bill Green and I, it was like fighting a long-lost brother, and we ended up doing a lot of projects together. He had been an NBC News reporter and had done video productions, and we combined our efforts and started doing some work in video. But as we got further on, we actually also did a research project together, which is in the year 2000, they made an amazing discovery by deciphering the DNA sequence. And to give somewhat of a sense of its dimensions, if you were to put a regular stack of 8.5 by 11 paper as high as the Washington Monument in 12-point font, that's about how many characters are on the DNA sequence. And by looking at certain markers on that sequence and comparing them with indigenous communities, you could actually trace back your immigration heritage 80,000 years. So Bill Grudy and I did this, and this actually is, we did this independent match. And this is the migration of our ancestors from the last 80,000 years. And so it's believed that our ancestors probably began in this area around Olduvai Gorge, which is contemporary Ethiopia, Eritrea. And there, through natural disasters, climate change, through scarcity, war, other things, people moved and shifted through the Middle East to Asia and then arced their way back so that our ancestors in the area around wherever they started staying. And so this is the deep ancestry. And it's from there that they probably migrated to Ireland and then from there to the United States. So it's interesting how even science today is recognizing that migration is literally in our genes. So this stuff about Trump and all the changes going on, it's just not even a blip on the radar screen, that this has been happening from the beginning of time, and it's fundamental to our identity. But as we look even further on this, that migration is not only in our biological genes, it's also in our spiritual genes. And as you look at the Middle East today, it's really the land of the Bible in many ways. It's also the land where so many migrations in the Bible happened. And in this, you can see these contemporary boundaries. And it's there that really the first 11 chapters are not any place we can locate in historical space as we know it. But when we get to that 11th chapter, things become very definitive that we can see where God hears the call from Abraham, where he says, leave your country, go to the land that I will show you, and you will be a blessing. And from that point on, from the patriarchs, Exodus, the exile to Jesus' migration himself to our human race, to the movement of the apostles, all the way to the end when the disciples are sent to all the nations of the world. And even John from an island in Patmos, which is now contemporary Turkey, he has a vision of the people of God as fundamentally being in migration back to a homeland. And so from beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation, you can see the migration goes through all of the scriptures. And so part of this research was to look at this connection between the narrative of migration in the scriptures, the themes that are connected to migration, and the narratives today of migrants. And so through all of that, there is a correlation between migration in biblical times and migration in our own. But you can see going back to this was the path of Abraham, leaving Ur, going up to Haran, moving down into the Fertile Crescent, and then moving down into Egypt and coming back again and settling in what is today Israel, Palestine. So migration's in our spiritual genes, and it's deep in our DNA. But it's also something that's part of our consciousness today. Here's one example of a boat that crossing the Mediterranean today. Thousands and thousands of people have died crossing this area, if you will. And there was one story that Pope Francis heard where a group of refugees like this were on a boat and the boat capsized, and only 8 people survived. And they survived by clinging to a fishing net in the middle of the ocean. But when the fishermen saw them, instead of saving them, they eventually cut their nets and cast them to die into the ocean depths. And Pope Francis was so moved by the indifference of these migrants that he went down to the island near where it happened, a small island named Lampedusa, which is only 6 square miles in area. And there he celebrated Mass by an ocean harbor. But interestingly enough, he used a chalice that was made from the driftwood of a refugee boat. So in the same way, what does it mean to use a chalice in a mass made from the driftwood of a refugee boat? What is that? What is the connection between that chalice and Jesus' story? What's the connection between that chalice and the migrants who are on that boat? What's the connection between that chalice and our story? These are all the things that I think came together in this research. And so sometimes it's also said that what the bishops do at the US border is in fact an American Lampedusa, although they've been celebrating the Mass there well before this event happened. But here you can see the Mass that, in this case, it's in Arizona. This one is near Nogales. And this is the bishops on the American side connecting with bishops who would have been on the other side as well and celebrating again the Eucharist. And let me be clear, this is not really politicizing the Eucharist. It's actually making a very explicit spiritual faith commitment, which has political consequences. And so what does it mean to proclaim that unity and even to really believe in the eschatological promise of that unity, even why our society is so divided on this issue of migration? So these are some of the things that I'd like to look at today. But as I was working on this book, and it was really a 20-year project, there was a culmination of a lot of research and mostly stories with the borders and trying to ask, what is the connection between migration and Eucharist? So what I did in the book was to really take the structure of the Eucharist and use it as a heuristic device to get a new narrative around migration. And so what I hope to offer you here today is not just give you more information about migration, but open up a new imagination about it, and in particular, Eucharistic imagination. It's preceded by an entrance rite, and the last part is a communion rite. And so these are really the 4 parts of the talk that I'd like to go into today, which is the first is to look at the entrance rite, or the introductory rite, which is to look at the facts and the statistics of migration around the world. So the structure of the rite is just a way of reading the migration reality, but this first is to really look at the contemporary context, not just in the United States, but globally. The second is to look at what I call the liturgy of words, which is the conceptual and often debated and conflictual territory. And here I want to bring out not only what is other people are saying about migrants, but even what's right about these things that people are saying that we even may disagree with. And so how do we look at the complexity of this debate and begin to untangle it and assess it in more detail? The third is to really make a theological move at the stage setting and to really look more closely at this liturgy of Lampedusa, which I just talked about, and there specifically address the theological territory of migration. And then fourthly, the last part is to look at the concluding rite, where, as Mike said in the beginning, we look at what is in effect the mission of mercy, which is enacting that's just really looking at who's feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, getting drink to the thirsty, and so on, and how it is really the mission of the church, really a mission of reconciliation. And so all of this is interconnected to that. So that's where we're going today. And so where I'd like to begin is to just look first at this introductory rite, which is really the stage setting of migration. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is not a new topic. It's something that's been going on since the beginning of time. But what is different today are the sheer numbers. Right now, there are more international migrants than ever before. So these are people who are living away from their homeland for more than a year. There are 281 million international migrants around the world. This means that 1 out of every 28 people in the world right now is a migrant. And of that number, 100 million of them are refugees, which is more than in any moment, even during World War II. So a refugee is someone who has demonstrable proof that they have a well-founded fear of persecution because of race, religion, nationality, social membership, and other factors. Right now, of those who have it, there is only 1 in 100 that get it. So there are many more, I think, that could qualify for strictures and systems make it very hard for people to even certify that. I can remember one time I was in Istanbul. This was in 2014. These were people that were fleeing Iraq and fleeing Syria. And they said the earliest they could get an appointment to begin an interview for refugee status determination was 2026. And it's from 2014. So the system itself is not able to even qualify people to this degree. But as we look even more at this, if refugees were settled in one particular place, they'd be the 21st largest country in the world. and they'd be growing at a rate of 38,000 people a day or 24 people per minute. And if we were to actually look at all those who are moving within countries, that is people who are internally displaced, there would be as many as 1 billion people, which is 1 out of 7 people in the world. And these numbers are only going to continue to grow as time goes on. We look at climate refugees whose water sources and livelihood dries up or evaporates, as well as climatic changes, just will force the displacement within the next 50 years. These numbers are from 100 million to hundreds of millions, up to even 450 million within our lifetime. So all of that really points to the fact that we are really living in what some scholars call an age of migration. It's one of the most defining, if not the most defining issue of our times. But behind these staggering numbers are people. And this was one picture I remember that for about 15 years, I was on the Bishop's Committee on Migration and Refugees, and we would go out to areas of concern or areas where these crises were going on. And I can remember during the Syrian refugee crisis, this is probably about 10 years ago, there were a number of people, some still had bullets in them, hadn't even been attended to yet. But I think this was one group of women who, the woman holding her head in her hands, had already lost 2 sons. These are her daughters that are there pictured, her daughters-in-law. And she just got news that her grandson had been killed and that her 3rd son was put in prison. And it brought out such a response from her in such agony that you can look at the woman next to her. You could see that these are Muslim women. There are just no words, not even words about God that could begin to name the pain of this woman. And the humanity of this, the suffering of this, the agony of this really spoke volumes. And so much so that I often say that the Pietà with years twice in my life. So the first one I saw carved out of living stone, it was carved out of stone in Rome. And the second was seeing it carved out of living experience in the lives of these people. This is what these people today are really just the very tip of an iceberg of millions and millions of people who are struggling for a more dignified life. And once you hear those stories, it changes you. And if it doesn't change you, then we have bigger problems than migration, I think, in our country, because the raw humanity really comes forth through it. But this is the age of migration, and these are the signs of our times. And so as we look at these signs of our times, we still have a lot of reactions to that. And that's why in the second part of the presentation, I want to look at what's called the liturgy of words. And I want to say 2 things in this section. The first thing is that migration is an incredibly complex issue. And if one doesn't really understand that complexity, either they aren't paying attention or they don't understand. The second thing I would say is migration is an incredibly simple issue. And if people don't realize that, either they aren't paying attention or they don't understand. And when you look at this, I just give you one example of that too, is that during my research, I think some of the more illuminating moments was working with the Border Patrol, both in this country and also overseas, places like Slovakia and other places, that I'd go out with the Border Patrol in their helicopter surveillance missions, or as they were doing search and rescue missions, or what they call a ride along. And I remember one time I was on this ride along the southern border near Tucson, and this one agent was talking to me as we were driving along in this Ford Bronco truck. And he was on public relations duty with me, and he started driving along the wall. So we're literally in the Ford Bronco truck, we're just driving along. And so he said, one time I was in this area, and his words, he says, these aliens come across. And he says, I went after them. And he says, well, he didn't realize that some of them were smoking drugs and they had automatic weapons. He says, they turned around and started raining machine gun fire. And he says, I hit it. And he said, I just felt these bullets whiz over my head. And he said, it was so traumatic that I had to go to counseling. He says, I'd wake up with nightmares. He said it had affected my sleep and my relationship with my wife. And he said, it's been a very hard thing to recover from. And I remember when he shared that story, suddenly it was, wow, this guy put his life on the line every day. And I never realized the Border Patrol agent was doing that. And so I really began to see him from another perspective. But then as we went on, I think probably about 2 hours later, we were a little further north of the border, maybe about 30 miles north. And so I said, well, how do you know which vehicles to stop? And so he gave me certain descriptors that he looked for. It was no more than 2 minutes after I asked him that this vehicle went by. It looked very suspicious. And suddenly he passed by this vehicle, slipped on his nest, did a quick turnaround, and then went and hopped to see this view. And then in a moment, I just saw this big cloud of dust and I saw these migrants running in every direction. And my reaction was telling, because my first reaction was I was so much in the mind of this border patrol agent, and I was like, oh, I hope he gets him. And then I stepped back and I remembered all these migrants that worked with her for these years. I'm like, no, I hope they get away. And then that's something like, whoa. And so he's running after these guys. And then in the back seat, the only thing that they had with them was pics. They had a prayer booklet, like a missal, and they had pictures at their kid's baptism. And it someday dawned on me, I'm like, why are we chasing after these folks and criminalizing these folks, which over time you see the vast majority, and even the Border Patrol would say they're 98.9% of those coming across the border are hardworking people looking for jobs. They're not criminals, not drug dealers, they're not people like we talked about in the first part of the story. So that made me realize that this is an incredibly complex issue. But I realized too that to be fair to this, I had to go deeper into that complexity. So for years, I would talk to human rights advocates, rescue leaders, emergency hospital rooms, and corporations, church leaders, and others, and try to ask, what's the most positive spin on what you're doing? And so this is years of research that went into this, but this is the synthesis of the things that and so the first group that I would identify are vigilante groups. And I would say our findings are both transnational in the sense that if you go to other countries, you can see representatives of this same idea, and transhistorical. If anybody has seen more recently the movie Cabrini, you'll see themes that go into the discrimination against Irish immigrants, Irish and Italian immigrants that would parallel many of the ones that are happening today with Mexican immigrants or other immigrants from other parts of the world. So this is not there are new particulars, but the kind of the theme itself, the othering of the migrant, is something deep in human history. But to try to just not judge these folks and what they're doing as wrong or different, but to really say, what are they trying to do? Vigilantes really are trying to protect personal property along the border, to prevent unlawful entry, and to fill in the gaps where federal enforcement fails. So they say these people are crossing the border. They're a nuisance at best, but they're actually dangerous at worst. And it's just not good that they're coming along without any authorization. So they're concerned citizens who take things into their own hands in order to protect the country and often their property. The Department of Homeland Security, or ICE, Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, their goal is to enforce policy. They don't make the policy, but their job is to enforce it, to ensure order and prevent unlawful entry, especially of foreign invaders who can harm its citizens. What's interesting is I was doing this research well before 911. And after 911, even the mentality of the Border Patrol and what they were doing changed dramatically. I went from basically keeping the border orderly and keeping out drugs to basically preventing terrorists from coming across. In fact, right before Bush was only in office for a few months in September, now you might remember that, September 11th or 13th, I think, they were about to mark a whole new immigration reform plan. But once those planes hit the tower, everything changed. It changed quickly. And it's very hard to distinguish the terrorist from the immigrant that all got amalgamated in people's imagination. This third group are political leaders. What they're trying to do is to create federal policy to protect the citizens of the country and to manage its resources. And this has changed a lot over time, that in the early days of the country, we let in almost everybody, but we did make some exceptions. That you could turn away people at Ellis Island and other places if you were an anarchist or had certain diseases. Nowadays, we let in almost nobody, but we make some exceptions. And so what politicians do, how they make decisions on who belongs. In fact, even if you read some Gen Franklin's works, you can substitute out the word German for Mexican, and it would be the same rhetoric that we often find today in the media. Corporations as well want to hire cheap and or talented labor. They want to maximize profits or sustain a competitive advantage, and they want to sell products at lowest cost. So they're becoming more increasingly vocal on the issue of migration. The next group are church leaders, and really at the heart of the mission of the church is to proclaim a God of life, protect the rights of human beings who are made in God's image and likeness. And Pope Paul VI said the mission of the church is ultimately to build a civilization of love. So it's to denounce injustice and it's to announce the reign of God. And then finally, human rights advocates, they're trying to protect the rights of immigrants. They're trying to protect the exploitation of the vulnerable and to fight for human dignity. Borrowing from different sort of points of view, but having a lot in common with what the church is trying to do. Their goal is often to fight for human life and for human rights. So from this perspective, everybody has a position and there's a validity to each one of those positions. So how do you begin to sort out those positions and begin to prioritize those and begin to assess the relative worth or not of those positions? This is where it gets a little complicated. So as we go a little deeper in this, one of the things that we began to see is that underneath these arguments, there are different rights at stake. There are different rights that people are trying to advance. This group is really trying to advance property rights, protect individual property rights. Even the church too recognizes there is a right to property. There's violence, and how does that right in face of the other rights? This group is really trying to really emphasize the role of sovereign rights, namely the right of a nation to protect its border, something also the church recognizes. Thirdly, there are cultural rights. In this case, how do we determine what it means to be an American? And by what criteria to use? It's an experiment to bring together so many different kinds of nations and cultures under the rule of law. This group is trying to fight for economic rights and how to keep it fair and open. This group is trying to really speak about natural rights, namely those given by God. And this group is looking at human rights classically defined. So when you look at it this way, then the question is, how do you begin to prioritize these rights? How do you begin to assess one right over another right? How do these interrelate with each other? This is where it gets complicated. But however you look at it, there are really three fundamental positions that come down to the political policies. This group says, close the borders, keep them out, protect what we have, put more agents on the border, build a bigger wall. This is mostly Democrat and Republican policy that we've had for the last 40, 45 years. This group is saying, look, they need the work and we need the workers. Let's create a legal system that allows people to go back and forth. The last time we really tried this with mixed results, but it was when World War II happened, when the men were off in Europe fighting the war and there was a deficit in the labor needs in the United States. So we brought braceros, people from Mexico, to the United States who worked there for a period of time as guest workers. This is really one of the few places where there can be somewhat of a cost-benefit analysis here, allowing workers to come. This group here is trying to really make the case for legalization, saying the church in particular, you can't simultaneously benefit from the labor of undocumented workers and labor of migrant workers and make a profit from it at the same time. And that there should be some right to earn Catholic citizenship. And this became very clear when I was working in rural communities in Mexico, that a lot of these communities were just women and children. So you can't just also have people come up to, say, work in the United States while the families are back home. That creates a social disintegration. So these groups would make a case that it's not just an economic analysis or an economic cost we're talking about, it's a social cost as well, when that looks at the disintegration of the family. Now, here's where it begins to shift. So at this point, I'm going to make basically an argument. So up until now, I'm presenting different positions. At this point, you're welcome to disagree with me. You're welcome to challenge what I'd say. But here, I'm being very explicit about it. I'm going to make an argument here. Is at this point where things begin to change and things are not all equal is really what language you use in the debate. So the heart of really what I want to look at today is not just not just more information about migration, but really a new narrative about migration. One in this case that we'll get to is theologically informed. But how you tell that narrative depends a lot on language. And those of you who've done rhetorical studies or literary studies, feminist studies, you know that language shapes your reality. And the language you use in the debates are going to really shape reality. And so this group actually sees them as aliens. This is actually the official language of the U.S. government. You're aliens. And so it's rather striking. I remember one time being with a colleague of mine from Canada, and he said, he married somebody from Canada, and he says, is that an immigration hearing? And as they were talking, they were going back and forth with this officer. And so he looked over at his colleague I know and said, how long do you know this alien? I know he's speaking about his wife. It was just, what do you mean? And that the language you use of that, in fact, on my first book, I was on the spirituality of the undocumented immigrants, and I thought I was going to call it alien spirituality. And So I thought maybe Sigourney Weaver could do the introduction to it or something. But, when you think about that, I remember one time being at this conference in Geneva with other folks from the United Nations. And it was a church kind of UN conversation. And so there were some people in that conversation where they said the states gives rights to these people. And I looked at them and I said, no, they don't actually. They said, God gives rights to these people. It's the states that have to make sure those rights are protected. But where you start on that question makes a big difference. So these are more than just semantics. The rooting of your arguments and how you use language in that narrative is going to have a lot of ethical dimensions to it. So this group has a very particular way of looking at it. This group sees it as workers. And actually, I'm not an economist, but if actually you look at really hardcore economists, even somebody like Levins in our university, when they've studied this, that it basically, you to say, are they a drain? So the rhetoric and the narrative is they're going to take from us, they're going to steal from us, they're just going to use social services, they're going to be a drain on us. And by the way, actually, that when you look at refugees around the world, 85% of all refugees basically are in developing countries. So the burden of the resources dedicated to migrants and refugees, not in if you will, in Europe and North America. Actually, it's in the developing countries that have to absorb the burden of a lot of refugees. And so that's just a fact. But in this case, workers' arguments can be on either side, whether they give or gain, whether they give or take, but it's actually about parity. Bill Levins would say they actually take a little more in the first 7 years. And then after that, the evidence is that they actually give back a lot more. And when you think about some of the major industries in the United States right now, Google, Intel, eBay, Sun Microsystems, these were all started by immigrants who are like hundreds of thousands of people. It's not just that they're working illegally in the fields, but they're actually part of initiative and creativity and the economic engine that makes the country thrive. Third group, and this is not a particularly deep thought, but it's an important one because this group sees it as people. And if we can't actually get this piece right, then nothing else will hold together because if they are human beings, made in the image and likeness of God, that roots the ethics of this in a very different moral equation than if they're just people that can be moved around. In fact, some of the harder kind of instances when you hear stories about migrants be working in the field for weeks at a time and they'd be told they'd be paid at the end of a job. And then they come back and then finally as soon as they're done with the work, someone calls the border patrol and rounds up. And that kind of exploitation is a sin that Christ to happen. That's just really one that I think is such an offense to God. But this is really the kind of issue here, I think, in terms of looking at this perspective. But here's really where another place where it breaks down. And I would say, giving this talk over the years, probably one area that is rather striking to me is really the legal question. And this really comes from educated people, even as that somehow, in some form or another, with different levels of aggressiveness and hostility, they will ask me, Father, which part of the legal don't you understand? And Don, I remember you one time saying, you just want to say back to them, like, which part of the gospel don't you understand? That can have its own kind of reverberations. But the bottom line is the issue really, I think, rather is which part of the law don't you understand? Because Thomas Aquinas says there are in fact 4 laws. Mark Portman could get into this in a lot more detail. But Aquinas really says that there are 4 laws. There is natural law by which parents need to feed their family. There's a civil law which society is used to organize themselves for the common good. There's a divine law, which we know through scripture, about feeding the hungry and the thirsty and so on. And there's eternal law through which God keeps the universe going. The key as human beings for justice to happen, those laws have to align. But if you have civil laws, let's think about racial discrimination, that you can't use the same bathroom or go to the same schools. If you have racial discrimination that are at variance, civil law that are at variance with natural laws, that's where the discord results. So the goal is to bring this into harmony. But how this plays out is this group is going to emphasize civil laws. And so the arguments are usually like what I call arguments of the invisible mind. What are you, crazy? These people are going to ruin our culture. They're going to take our jobs. They're going to make us eat salsa and tacos for the rest of our life. It's just something that's just going to just ruin everything. So it's like any rational person would never let them in. Although they'll be quick to point out, especially now with all the drama going on in Texas right now, is look, we didn't cross the border. The border crossed us. You go to places like San Antonio. Remember, there's this woman there once who the San Fernando Cathedral has been there since the early 1700s. And she said, my ancestors were here when this was part of New Spain. They were here also when this was
a part of Mexico. They were here also when this was the state of Texas. And they were here also, that's the United States. He said, we're not sure which country is coming through here next, but we're still going to be here. So when you think about it, that these laws do change. This group is going to emphasize the economic laws. Classically speaking, Adam Smith spoke about the power of the invisible hand. But the problem is Adam Smith never had in that in mind a capitalist economy. He had in mind a human economy that was bound together by non-capitalist moral sentiments. But I think the danger here is that if we too quickly say, let's let the economy work this out, we become vulnerable to other idols. And probably the most common of which would be money theism, is that we really make money into the ultimate measure of all value. And therefore we use that in such a way that it has very consequential human costs. This last group really appeals to the natural laws, or what the United Nations calls the invisible heart. So that raises questions about what it means to be a society, how we come together, how we even disagree with each other, but how we also treat those who are most vulnerable. All these are at stake. But in the end, there's one final and important question underneath this, which is the question of who is the other? So really, this is the most universal question here. And that really boils down to everybody from my roommate, my family members, to somebody who's a migrant. And so while the dominant political narrative right now is moving towards the othering of the migrant, okay, there is a whole other way of looking at this. But if you look at these groups together, this first group is going to emphasize really fundamentally a fear of the other. The second group is going to look at the usefulness of the other. And this third group is going to look at ultimately the connections to the other. So this is where the deeper migration needs to happen. We may find ourselves in any one of these quadrants, maybe at different points in time. But the question is, can we move through these different parts into places of greater communion, connection? And for that reconciliation needs to happen. So let me summarize the second part by just saying that what we have at the border then is not just a geopolitical issue. We also have a tension zone that really is looking at a tension between sovereign rights and human rights, namely the right of a nation to protect its borders, but also the right of the people to a dignified life and even to migrate if necessary. Secondly, it's the right of the nation to order and organize a system of regulations for the common good, namely civil law, but also natural law, the right of people to provide for families, to feed, educate, and shelter them. Thirdly, it's a tension between national security and human insecurity, namely the right of a nation to protect its inhabitants from harm and violence, especially from the outside, and also the right of people to protect their families from undue need, hunger, and excessive poverty, vulnerability. And for this last part, I'm going to make a different shift here, and that is really moving from, I think, a tension between citizenship and discipleship, and that is moving from trying to understand what are the expectations and duties of being a member of the state, but then to move even deeper into that, to say, what does it actually mean to be a disciple in such a way that it challenges those who profess faith in Christ to respond to the inclusive demands of the gospel. So that goes, I think, even further. So in this third part, I'm going to look more specifically at the liturgy of the Eucharist, and it is a kind of a migration into a different place. And I remember when I was in 8th grade, I was very struck by when my family and I were driving in at the East Coast, and we were going to visit some relatives, and there was a pamphlet on the ground, and it had a very provocative title, and it just said, "Did you know that you could actually miss heaven by 18 inches?" And I was very taken by it. And as I opened it up, it actually said the distance between the head and the heart are only 18 inches. And I was very taken by that, because it says that God is not just someone to know in one's head conceptually or theologically, but one to encounter in one's heart. And only if one can make that migration do I actually really fundamentally know God. Native Americans took that even further, and they said, no, it's actually from the head to the heart to the feet, and really enacting that. And I was giving a talk out in Rochester, Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic, and this one nurse was in the audience, and she says, let me share one other insight here. She says, the carotid artery connects the head and the heart. And she says, if you were to cut off that process, your blood would immediately become toxic and you'd die very quickly. She says it needs to be this circulatory process where what's in your head goes through your heart and then back to your head again. And I think that's so important in something like migration, because we just get stuck in our ideas, or we may have vague sentimental kind of, feelings of sympathy with people. But like, how do we do this intelligently, compassionately, in ways that lead to real wisdom and understanding? But then this third part, I want to just frame this with a story as well. I was doing some research in the North African border in a place outside of Morocco, in a small border town called Ceuta. So Ceuta is actually a European colony on the African coast. It's very small, maybe not much bigger than South Bend, Mishawaka. And there I found some refugees that were hiding out in mountains and some of the other spaces there. And I spent about 3 days with them. They're from sub-Saharan Africa, one from Uganda, one from Eritrea, and another from Somalia. And after talking with them for about 3 days, one of them looked at me and said, "So what do you do?" And so they knew I was a priest, but they said, "You work in a parish?" He said, "I teach." And I started to get more sheepish the more questions they asked. And they said, "What do you teach?" I said, "This is like the most authoritative jury I was ever going to have in front of me too." And I just thought, okay, I actually teach some stuff on theology and migration. Theology and migration. And then he looks at me and goes, "Huh." He said, "Some people say the reason why we're suffering so much here in Africa was because we're descendants of Judas. Because what Judas did to Jesus, we're paying the consequences." He said, "What do you think of that?" I said, "Manuel, here's another way to think about it. And if you're asleep, just wake up for the 30 seconds, because this is the most important thing I'm going to say tonight." Right. So I said, God in Jesus Christ so loved the world that he migrated into our sinful and broken existence, and there died on the cross to reconcile us so that we can migrate back to our homeland and become naturalized citizens again. So that God in Jesus Christ is always breaking down those walls and those barriers and those divisions that we erect as human beings that keep us from being in relationship with God and with one another. And as we look at that, there are 4 kinds as we look at the tradition. And the first is really the image of God, which is passing over the inhuman-human divide. You talk to migrants in deserts and canals, crossing over oceans and other places. I often sometimes ask them, what would you say if you were right here where I am right now tonight? What would you say to people? They say, "I just want to be a human being." One migrant said to me, "I've crossed the deserts and almost baked." He says, "I've crossed over the mountains and almost frozen." He said, "About days without water and food and almost starved to death." He says, "Stowed away in the baggage and purpose of buses and almost suffocated to death." He says, "That stuff's really hard." He said, "But you know what the hardest part about being a migrant is? Is when people treat you like you're a dog and like you're the lowest life on earth and like you're known." So what migrants are crying out for is just, it's this undeconstructible kind of part of it that says that I know I am a human being and I want to just be treated as one. This is 90% of the migration issues. And we're not trying to get rich, trying to take over. We just want to work often so that we can send money home to help our families. The second is the word of God, which is passing over the divine human divine. Now, this is striking because when Jesus left his homeland, if you will, when Jesus migrated from heaven to Mary's womb, Mary was already pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Okay, you just heard that in the scripture just in Feast of St. Joseph. So when this great migration happens, and Jesus entering our world, Mary was betrothed to Joseph. And to be found pregnant by somebody other than the betrothed would put Mary outside the law. Joseph has a big issue with this. Who wouldn't, right? And it raises the question of why did God in Jesus Christ choose to save the world in this way? And to be more specific, why would he actually choose to save the world through an illegal alien? He was illegal because he was actually born out of wedlock. And he was an alien because he really wasn't about that. If that doesn't mess up our imaginations, then we're probably not thinking about the text as deeply as we should. Or could it really be the beginning of the good news? Because God's breaking out of all these categories of worthy and unworthy in order to talk about the gratuitous gift of salvation that's offered to everybody, even in the special who is outside the law. That's breaking down. That's breaking down the law. And that's really what Paul says that Jesus' death ultimately does, is he breaks down the law of enmity between us in order to bring us back into fellowship and relationship with God and another again. The third is the mission of God, which is passing over the human divide. This is a really profound thing because when Jesus came, the main thing he came to teach and to preach was God's kingdom. And that kingdom was symbolized by the table. What Jesus did was that he invited everybody to table. And my good friend Virgil always said that Jesus, when he invited everybody to the table, he rejected rejection. By inviting sinner, tax collector, prostitute, Gentile to the table, Jesus welcomed everybody. And in welcoming everybody, he rejected rejection. But there are some people at that table who felt those people didn't belong, so they rejected Jesus. So as he puts it, the reject who rejected rejection, however, is also the one who rises from the dead, which indicates Jesus' way is God's way. So that the mission of the church and following the mission of Jesus, ultimately to practice that table fellowship in ways that break down those divisions and bring people into a common team. Fourthly, is the vision of God, which is about crossing over the country kingdom. And so in this research, I really have found that there is a value to really understanding one's country and one's identity. Even you see this very interesting, like I've been around this place long enough where every August when these students come, it's like you arrive. You don't sit there saying, but I'm afraid, I'm scared, I don't know who I am. I don't know if I belong, no one got care about me. But then you're like, suddenly you find out you're an alumni law. And so you got a green shirt. And you put on a green shirt, and then you're like, okay, we're to Austin. And then they're like, okay, they're over there. There's some deal on. They get red shirts. So that means that we're good and they're bad. And so you begin to develop this identity, and then you have these sub-identities within that. Okay, I belong in this section. But until the first football game, then you shift from being a dog to being a dog. And then suddenly it's like that identity shifts again. And if that identity doesn't shift, you get too balkanized. And I think this is what happens during the Olympics. I'm always watching during the Summer Olympics to see the United States beat China. And during the Winter Olympics, are we beating Russia? Well, now that they're not, I don't even know what to think of. But still, when you actually see some skaters from kind of other countries and they're blessing themselves before they ski, you're like, you know what? There is a deeper kind of identity that connects us beyond our nationalities. And that's really like, so if my actually self-understanding is this is my stuff, I earned it and it's mine, that's one way to live in the world. But if my self-understanding is everything I have is a gift, nothing I have, I own, find a way. And that when I die, I have to give it up. And that at best of the steward, I am be asked what I did with what I could give. That's a very different way to live in the world. And so this vision of God, basically, as we know through visiting Jesus, is really looking at this and saying it's the real crossing over is passing over just who I am and nationality to seeing who I am in relationship to other people. In other words, instead of just building those walls, it's actually building those bridges. In the end, it comes down to crossing over the life, death divide. And in that, it really brings out that God is constantly breaking down those divisions in order to bring us back into communion. There's many other things I would say. Let me just summarize these things. These are some of the places in Land Reduced. I just want to highlight some of the things this carpenter made, this chalice, this brazier, this mass, this altar made from pieces of shipwrecks of refugee boats made from the oars. All of this was important. But here you see the chalice itself. Now, when he was making the chalice, he said that he had to take out this nail from this one section. And he said it's very evocative of wounds as if they're Christ's own wounds. And he says when he put the nail back in, it made the form of a cross. And so on top of the cross actually sits the chalice of life. And so very powerful kind of symbol, but that chalice itself was made from the driftwood refuse boat. But as we come back to that Medusa, you can see Bishop Kirkanis here, who's giving communion to someone on the Mexican side of the border. Again, that's a nice scatological vision, saying in the end of time we will be. But how far we've migrated towards that communion will be determined by how much we really cross over, I think, in this side of eternity. So what I'd really try to do in this talk is to really give some perspective on the global refugee crisis, also to give expression to what Pope Francis calls the globalization of solidarity, and then really highlight what John Paul II really refers to as the globalization of solidarity. But all of this, I think, points to the Eucharist. And if I summarize that, it's really to really first recognize the presence, the real presence of those who are often considered nobodies in the world today. Those who die without a trace, those who often aren't recognized as human beings and are often discarded and not recognized. These are what we refer to as nobodies. And yet, underneath, they have a struggle to become somebody because they're created in God's image likeness, and possibly they want to be valued as such. And if we look closer, we can really see that there is, in fact, a connection to everybody that unites us. But in the end, there is a way in which the relationship to them is intimately connected to the body of Christ. In fact, if you look at sort of what they go through, And as Mike said in the very beginning, the Matthew 25 speaks about being hungry, thirsty, naked, sick, and prison estranged. They're hungry in their own lands, they're thirsty in the districts they cross. They're naked after being robbed, gunpoint, even down to their clothing. They're sick after having to drink sometimes even their own urine in order to survive. And they're often imprisoned in the detention centers. And at the end of this, they gather, they're treated like they're clean. So all of that really points to the fact that if we must have a Department of Homeland Security, maybe we could reenact it as well and say that migration, in fact, is not the main problem. Migration is a simple, deeper problem, which is causing people to move in the first place. And that the deepest solutions to this are not just in building bigger walls, borders, but actually working at development and really helping people stay in their homelands. And as we work toward that, recognizing that really one of the hallmarks of a healthy community is really hospitality. And all of this points to the way we relate to one another in a spirit of solidarity. So I end just at the beginning part of this section. I talked about the story of meeting these migrants in Morocco and sharing their stories. But I end up sharing this story about God wanting this reconciliation and calling us to mission. I got done what I was saying. I really wasn't sure what they were going to say. And so I just took a deep breath. And I was really struck because both what they didn't say as well as what they said. What they didn't say was, oh my gosh, those are really good insights. I hope you get those published in the peer-reviewed journal articles sometime. Actually, what happened was that this Emmanuel, he didn't even look at me, but he just jumped up from his chair. He was, yay, God. He says, I can't believe you do that for me. And then I was like, oh, that's what I'm doing. I didn't know myself what I was doing. But then I realized that what I tried to do in that moment was what I tried to do tonight is just share some reflection. It's the 4th chapter of Luke's Gospel, where he says, I've come to proclaim good news to the poor, sight to the blind, liberty to captives in the year of faith. Thank you.